I spent 30 long, grueling years in the windowless offices of the Department of Justice, staring into the eyes of some of the most calculated, cold-blooded criminals this country has ever seen, from high-ranking mob lieutenants to corporate vultures who'd sell their own mothers for a point on the stock market. So when I finally decided to retire, all I wanted was a little slice of quiet, a place where the only thing I had to prosecute was a stubborn weed in my flower bed. And that's how I ended up in Oak Grove, a gated community that looked like a dream on paper but felt like a prison the moment I stepped out of my car. And I had barely cracked the seal on my first box of books when I heard that sharp, unmistakable rhythmic pounding on my front door that immediately set off every alarm bell in my head. And when I opened it, there she was, Sandra Miller, the undisputed queen of the Oak Grove Homeowners Association. Standing there with her heels dug into my fresh sod, and a look of pure, unadulterated entitlement on her face that I'd seen 1,000 times in the interrogation room, holding a clipboard like it was a scepter, and a silver pen like a dagger as she informed me, without even a hello or a welcome to the neighborhood, that my moving truck had been parked on the curb for exactly 48 minutes past the community's unloading grace period, and that I was already being hit with a $400 fine that would be billed to my resident portal by sundown. And as I stood there in my old t-shirt and cargo shorts, looking like just another tired retiree, I tried to play the part of the polite neighbor, explaining that the movers had been delayed by a flat tire on the interstate. But she just cut me off with this shrill, patronizing laugh, telling me that rules are the fabric of a civilized society, and that if I couldn't handle the standards of Oak Grove, maybe I should have looked for a house in a trailer park. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't just about a moving truck, it was about power. Because over the next 2 weeks, Sandra Miller turned my retirement into a full-scale legal war, sending me a citation every single morning for the most microscopic infractions you can imagine, like my mailbox being 3 shades darker than the summer sandstone paint swatch she'd personally approved 5 years ago, or my lawn being exactly 1/4 of an inch above the 6-inch limit. And every time I tried to talk sense into her, she'd just point to her clipboard and tell me that the board's decision is final. But what Sandra didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have guessed while she was smirking at me from her silver Lexus, was that she was trying to bully a man who had literally spent his entire life studying the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO. And I started noticing things that a regular person wouldn't, like the fact that the approved landscaping company for the whole neighborhood was owned by her brother-in-law, or that the special security assessment fees we all paid were being funneled into a management company registered to a P.O. box in a state with no transparency laws. And it became crystal clear to me that Sandra wasn't just a bossy neighbor. She was running a high-stakes suburban shakedown, a tiny, localized mafia where she used the HOA bylaws as a way to extort thousands of dollars from innocent families. And it broke my heart to see my neighbor, an 80-year-old widower named Mr. Henderson, crying on his porch because Sandra had slapped a $5,000 fine on his house for a deteriorated roof that was actually in perfect condition, all because she wanted to force him into foreclosure so her developer husband could buy the lot for pennies on the dollar. And that's when the quiet prosecutor in me woke up and decided that retirement could wait, because I spent the next several nights in my darkened living room, not sleeping, but documenting every single interaction, every forged signature on the HOA board minutes, and every illegal lien she'd filed against the people on my street. And I realized that Sandra had become so arrogant, so drunk on her own petty authority, that she'd stopped covering her tracks, thinking that a bunch of suburbanites would never have the spine or the legal know-how to challenge her. So I played the victim, letting her pile up the fines, letting her think she was winning. And even when she showed up at my door a month later with a smug grin to tell me that she was initiating a forced sale of my home due to accumulated noncompliance debt, I didn't yell or scream. I just looked her dead in the eye and felt that cold, professional distance settle over me. The same feeling I got when I was about to drop a 500-page indictment on a criminal's head. And I told her, "Sandra, you've spent a lot of time telling me what I can't do with my house. You clearly haven't spent any time looking into who actually moved into this house." And her grin didn't even waver. She just told me that I was delusional and that she had friends in high places at the local courthouse. And as she walked away, swinging her clipboard like a trophy, I realized she was right about one thing. This was going to be a war. But she was dead wrong about the outcome, because I wasn't just going to fight her in the HOA meetings. I was going to dismantle her entire life. piece by piece, and show her exactly what happens when you try to fine a federal prosecutor into bankruptcy. And as I watched her drive away, I took out my phone and made one call to my old protege at the U.S. Attorney's Office, simply saying, "Hey kid, I've got a racketeering case for you, and it's happening right in my own front yard." And as the sun set over Oak Grove, I knew that the peace and quiet I'd moved here for was gone, but the thrill of the hunt was back. And Sandra Miller had no idea that she had just become the primary target of the most dangerous man she'd ever meet. A man who didn't care about the height of his grass, but cared very much about the height of the prison walls she was about to be living behind. And every fine she'd written me, every nasty note she'd left on my windshield, and every tear she'd made Mr. Henderson cry was now a documented piece of evidence in a federal investigation that was going to blow the lid off this neighborhood and send shockwaves through the entire state. Because the Queen of Oak Grove was about to find out that her crown was made of glass, and I was holding a very large, very legal hammer. The morning after my confrontation with Sandra, I didn't wake up as the tired retiree she thought I was, but as the meticulous investigator who had once untangled a $100 million Ponzi scheme. So I started my day not with gardening, but with a forensic deep dive into the public records of the Oak Grove Homeowners Association. Sitting in my dim home office with 3 monitors glowing and the scent of bitter black coffee filling the air, while I navigated the labyrinth of county property deeds and corporate filings that Sandra thought were buried deep enough to stay hidden. And it only took 3 hours of digging to find the first thread of the sweater that would eventually unravel her entire life, which was a special maintenance contract awarded 2 years ago to a company called Miller's Greenery and Design, a company that was registered to her nephew's home address and had been paid nearly $90,000 from our communal funds for emergency foliage restoration. That clearly never happened, considering the neighborhood park still looked like a scene from a Dust Bowl documentary. And as I scrolled through the digital ledgers, my legal instincts started screaming, because I realized this wasn't just a case of a bossy neighbor with a clipboard. It was a textbook example of wire fraud and systematic embezzlement disguised as civic duty. So I spent the rest of the week playing the part of the submissive victim, letting Sandra leave her neon orange violation notices on my windshield, and even waving politely when she drove by to snap photos of a stray leaf on my driveway. All while I was secretly coordinating with my old protege, Mike, at the U.S. Attorney's Office to set up a secure drop for the evidence I was compiling. And the situation reached a boiling point when I caught Sandra's security squad, 2 guys who looked like they'd been kicked out of every reputable police academy in the state, trying to tow Mr. Henderson's vintage Cadillac at 4 in the morning under the pretense of unauthorized long-term storage. And when I walked out onto the curb in my bathrobe, holding a flashlight and a very quiet, very firm recording of the encounter on my phone, Sandra appeared out of the darkness like a ghost in a tracksuit, her eyes bulging with a mix of fury and manic glee as she told me that interfering with association enforcement was a criminal offense and that she'd have me evicted by the end of the month. But I just stood there, watching the breath mist in the cold night air, and told her that if she touched that car, I'd be filing a civil suit for grand theft before the sun came up, which made her back down just enough for the tow truck to leave. But the look she gave me was one of pure, unadulterated war. And I knew she was going to double down on her efforts to bankrupt me. So I accelerated my timeline, pulling the tax returns of the Oak Grove Safety Fund, and discovering that the $30,000 surplus we were supposed to have had been drained into a consultancy account that led directly back to a shell corporation in Nevada, a state known for its corporate secrecy. And the beauty of it was that Sandra was so arrogant she was using the same bank for the HOA accounts that she used for her personal mortgage, a rookie mistake that made tracing the kickbacks as easy as following a trail of breadcrumbs in the snow. And by Wednesday, I had enough to trigger a federal grand jury investigation. But I wanted to make sure I had the smoking gun that tied her directly to the predatory foreclosures she'd been orchestrating. So I paid a visit to the local county clerk's office under the guise of researching historical architecture, and found the records of the last 5 homes that had been seized by the board, noting with a cold shiver of disgust that every single one of them had been sold at a closed-door auction to Miller Development Group, a company owned by Sandra's husband, which proved she was literally using her position to steal people's life savings and flip their homes for a massive profit. A scheme so crooked it would have made a street-level hustler blush, and the weight of the injustice hit me hard when I saw that one of the previous victims was a nurse who'd lost her house while she was working double shifts during the pandemic. And that's when I decided that I wasn't just going to get Sandra fired. I was going to see her assets frozen and her reputation incinerated in the town square. So I organized a secret meeting in my basement with 4 of the neighbors she'd targeted the most, including Mr. Henderson, and the air in the room was thick with fear and a little bit of hope as I showed them the bank statements and the forged board minutes I'd recovered, explaining to them that they weren't crazy and they weren't alone. They were just victims of a very small, very loud criminal organization. And I told them to keep playing the game, to keep paying the fines under protest, and to wait for my signal. Because the association meeting on Friday night was going to be the arena where Sandra's empire finally met the sword. And as the week drew to a close, Sandra's harassment reached a fever pitch, with her sending a professional inspector to my house who claimed my ivy was a biological hazard to the structural integrity of the community walls, and demanding a $15,000 immediate remediation fee. But I just smiled and signed the receipt, knowing that the $15,000 would be the last piece of evidence Mike needed to prove the extortion element of the RICO charge. And on the eve of the meeting, I sat on my porch, watching the stars and feeling a strange sense of peace, knowing that the prosecutor in me hadn't really retired at all. He'd just been waiting for a case that felt personal enough to fight for. And as I looked at the dark windows of Sandra's house across the street, I could almost see her sitting there with her clipboard and her greed, completely unaware that the man she'd been trying to bury was actually the person who was going to build her a very small, very permanent cell. And I thought about the irony of it all, how she thought she was protecting the value of the neighborhood, while she was actually the only thing rotting it from the inside out. And I realized that the paper trail I followed wasn't just a list of numbers and names. It was a map of every life she'd ruined and every dream she'd stepped on. And as I tucked the final file into my briefcase, I felt the weight of it, the responsibility of being the one who had the power to stop her. And I knew that by this time tomorrow, the neighborhood nightmare would finally be over. But for Sandra Miller, the real nightmare was only just beginning, because the feds don't knock with a clipboard, they knock with a battering ram, and I had already given them the keys to her kingdom. The Friday night meeting at the Oak Grove Clubhouse felt more like a funeral for the American dream than a neighborhood gathering. The air thick with the smell of stale coffee, burnt popcorn, and the palpable, shivering dread of 40 families who were tired of being hunted like prey in their own backyards. And there sat Sandra Miller at the front table, looking every bit the high society executioner in a power suit that probably cost more than Mr. Henderson's car, clutching that silver pen like it was a scepter of absolute rule while her 2 spineless board members sat beside her, staring at their shoes like they'd rather be facing a firing squad than the angry, broken people in the folding chairs. And Sandra didn't even wait for the clock to hit 7 before she struck the gavel with a crack that echoed like a gunshot through the silent room, immediately launching into a 20-minute monologue about community excellence and rising liability costs, which everyone in that room knew was just her coded language for another round of predatory fines and special assessments designed to bleed us dry. And as I sat in the back row, leaning against the cold brick wall with my briefcase tucked between my feet, I watched her eyes scan the crowd like a predator looking for the weakest link, until her gaze finally landed on me with a smirk so sharp it could have cut through steel, as she announced to the entire room that my property was officially being moved into the final stage of judicial foreclosure, due to what she called my gross and persistent noncompliance and mounting unpaid criminal assessments. And she actually had the audacity to pause, looking me dead in the eye with a look of pure, unadulterated triumph, and asked if I had anything to say to the board before they took the final vote to strip me of my home and my life savings. So I stood up slowly, the silence in the room becoming so heavy it felt like it was pressing the air out of my lungs. And I didn't start by shouting or begging or pointing fingers. I just opened my briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, asking her in that low, resonant prosecutor's voice that had made much tougher criminals than Sandra Miller crumble on the witness stand, if she could explain why the association's Safety and Security Fund had made 3 separate wire transfers totaling $45,000 to a holding company in the Cayman Islands that was registered under her maiden name. A question that made her smirk falter for just a fraction of a second before she snapped back that financial matters are the board's private jurisdiction and that I was out of order. But I wasn't out of order. I was just getting started, because as I began to walk toward the front of the room, I started handing out copies of the Nevada Shell Corporation filings and the kickback ledgers I'd spent the last week decoding. showing the neighbors exactly how she'd been using their hard-earned money to buy up their own foreclosed properties through a series of closed-door auctions held by Miller Development Group, a company owned by her own husband. And you could hear the collective gasp of the room as the realization hit them like a physical blow, seeing their own names on her priority seizure list and realizing that she wasn't protecting their property values. She was systematically harvesting their equity to build her own personal real estate empire. And Sandra started screaming, her face turning a shade of purple I'd only seen on people having heart attacks, yelling that I was defaming her, and that she'd have me arrested for harassment and illegal interference with a private board. But I just smiled and pulled out the $15,000 receipt she'd signed only 48 hours ago for that fake, biological hazard IV inspection. Explaining to the room, and the news camera I'd secretly had one of the neighbors set up in the back corner, that this was a textbook case of extortion and racketeering under the RICO Act. And when she realized that I wasn't just some grumpy, tired retiree, but a man who had actually spent 30 years writing the manuals on how to prosecute people exactly like her, her hands started shaking so hard that she dropped her precious silver pen on the floor. And I watched as the fear finally replaced the arrogance in her eyes, because she knew that I hadn't just found a few accounting errors. I had found the heart of her criminal enterprise, and I was currently ripping it out in front of everyone she'd ever bullied or intimidated. And the neighbors who had been terrified of her for years finally found their voices. Starting with Mr. Henderson, who stood up with tears in his eyes and told her exactly what he thought of her standards, while the rest of the room erupted in a chorus of demands for an immediate audit and her resignation. But I knew that a resignation wasn't going to be enough for a woman who had stolen people's peace of mind and tried to put them on the street. So I looked at my watch and told Sandra that she had exactly 3 minutes before this meeting was officially over, not by her gavel, but by the federal warrants that were currently being served at her house and her nephew's office. And as if on cue, the heavy double doors of the clubhouse swung open, and my protege Mike stepped in with 4 plainclothes agents, their badges gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights as they moved toward the front table with the kind of professional efficiency that only comes from years of high-level enforcement. And as they read her rights in front of the entire community she had terrorized. Sandra tried to maintain some shred of her Queen of the HOA persona, screaming that this was a political hit job and that she had friends in the governor's office. But the sound of the handcuffs clicking shut around her wrists was the final, beautiful period at the end of her long, crooked sentence. And as she was led out of the clubhouse in tears, her power suit wrinkled and her reputation in absolute tatters, the silence that followed wasn't one of shock, but of a massive collective exhale as 40 families realized they finally had their neighborhood and their lives back. And I sat back down in my chair, feeling the adrenaline slowly fade into a deep, satisfying exhaustion, knowing that while I might have moved to Oak Grove for the quiet, I had stayed for the justice. And as I looked at the broken silver pen lying on the floor under the table, I realized that the prosecutor's revenge wasn't about the money or the fame. It was about showing people like Sandra Miller that no matter how much fake authority you wrap yourself in or how many clipboards you carry, you can never truly hide from a man who knows exactly where you buried the bank statements. And as the neighbors crowded around me with handshakes and hugs that felt like they'd never end, I realized that my retirement was going to be a lot more interesting than I'd planned. Because once you've spent a lifetime hunting monsters, you realize they don't just live in dark alleys and corporate boardrooms. Sometimes they live right across the street and wear a tracksuit. But as the police cars pulled away with their sirens silent out of respect for the neighborhood's quiet hours, I knew that the nightmare was finally over, and that for the first time in years, the sun was going to rise over Oak Grove and find a community that was actually free. The silence that settled over Oak Grove in the wake of Sandra's arrest wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence she'd enforced with her clipboard and fines, but a light, breathing kind of quiet that felt like the entire neighborhood had finally been allowed to take its first real breath in 6 years. And as I stood on my porch the next morning, watching the federal agents carry boxes of evidence out of her house, everything from laptop towers to hidden ledgers tucked away in floor safes, I felt a strange sense of closure that even 30 years in the Department of Justice hadn't quite given me, because this time the victory wasn't just a notch on a career belt, but a shield for the people I shared a fence with. And it didn't take long for the true scale of the devastation Sandra and her husband had caused to come to light, as the forensic accountants Mike sent over began to peel back the layers of the Miller Development Group, only to find that they hadn't just targeted Oak Grove, but had used similar predatory tactics in 4 other subdivisions across 3 counties, creating a massive, interconnected web of property theft that totaled nearly $4 million in stolen equity and fraudulent fees. And I spent my retirement mornings sitting at my kitchen table, helping my neighbors navigate the mountain of paperwork required to file for restitution. Seeing the look of pure, unadulterated hope return to Mr. Henderson's eyes when he learned that the $10,000 lien against his home had been officially vacated by a federal judge. But the real satisfaction came 6 months later, when the trial finally reached the sentencing phase in a high-security federal courtroom downtown where Sandra Miller, stripped of her power suits and her designer sunglasses, sat at the defense table looking small, gray, and utterly broken as she listened to the victim impact statements of the people whose lives she had tried to dismantle for the sake of a few more points on a bank statement. And when it was my turn to stand before the judge, I didn't speak as the neighbor from 4B, but as the prosecutor I had always been, laying out for the record the cold, calculated cruelty of a woman who had weaponized a community's rules to fulfill her own psychopathic greed. And I watched as the judge, an old colleague who knew exactly how much I valued the integrity of the law, looked down at Sandra and told her that, of all the criminals who have passed through this courtroom, the ones who betray the trust of their own neighbors are the most deserving of the full weight of the statutes. And then he handed down a sentence of 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole, followed by a total forfeiture of all her assets to be distributed back to the families she had defrauded. A moment of justice so perfect that it felt like a physical weight had been lifted off the shoulders of everyone sitting in the gallery. And when her husband was led away to a separate cell to face his own conspiracy charges, the queen of the HOA was officially dethroned for good, leaving behind a legacy of ash and a very long list of people who would never forget the man who moved into the ivy-covered colonial and decided to fight back. And back in Oak Grove, the transition was just as dramatic as we officially dissolved the old board and replaced it with a volunteer committee that actually valued transparency and kindness, turning the safety fund that Sandra had drained into a genuine community grant program that funded a new playground and a scholarship for the local high school kids. And even the ivy on my house seemed to grow greener now that it wasn't being treated as a biological hazard by a woman with a grudge and a clipboard. And as for me, I finally found the peace I'd been looking for, spending my days actually gardening and my evenings sitting on the porch with Mr. Henderson, talking about the old days and the quiet power of a community that refuses to be bullied. And I realized that while I might have been the one with the legal expertise to trip the wire, it was the collective courage of the neighborhood that truly ended the nightmare, because predators like Sandra Miller only thrive when good people are too afraid to speak up. But once you show them that the man next door might just be the one person who can dismantle their entire world with a single phone call, they realize that their authority is nothing more than a paper shield against a federal storm. And as I watched the sunset over the gated community that was finally starting to feel like a home, I knew that the prosecutor's revenge wasn't about the prison time or the money, but about the fact that Oak Grove was finally free. And for the first time in 30 years, I didn't feel like a man who was hunting monsters. I just felt like a neighbor, and that was the greatest victory of all. It has been exactly 1 year since the handcuffs clicked shut on Sandra Miller's wrists, and the silver Lexus was towed out of her driveway as a seized asset of the federal government. And as I sit here on my porch watching the golden Colorado sun dip behind the mountains, I can tell you that the transformation of this neighborhood has been nothing short of a suburban miracle, because the poison she dripped into our lives has finally been filtered out by the sheer force of a community that decided to care about each other again. And I spent most of this morning down at the courthouse, watching the final liquidation of the Miller Development Group, assets which resulted in a massive restitution check being cut for the families she tried to destroy. And seeing Mr. Henderson finally get his $5,000 fine back with interest was a moment that tasted better than any high-profile win I ever had in my 3 decades at the DOJ. But the real legacy of this fight isn't just the money or the fact that Sandra is currently spending her days in a 6x9 cell in a federal facility 3 states away. It's the way the fences, both literal and metaphorical, have started to come down across our cul-de-sacs. Because now, instead of scanning for violations or worrying about the height of their grass, my neighbors are actually talking to each other, sharing tools, hosting block parties that don't require a 20-page permit, and looking out for one another in a way that makes the gated entrance feel like a welcome mat rather than a security checkpoint. And I even received a desperate, handwritten letter from Sandra last month, mailed from the prison library, where she had the delusional audacity to ask me to review her case for procedural errors, as if she still thought she could manipulate the very man who dismantled her life. But I didn't even finish reading it before I dropped it into the shredder, because some people are so addicted to power that they'll try to wield it from behind bars. But she's officially a ghost in the system now. A cautionary tale that we tell new residents when they ask why our community is so tight-knit, and why we don't have a traditional HOA board anymore, but rather a resident-led council that focuses on helping people rather than hunting them. And as for my ivy-covered colonial, it's finally the sanctuary I dreamed of when I first decided to retire. A place where the air is clear, and the only knocking on my door is a neighbor bringing over a six-pack of craft beer or asking for advice on their taxes. And I realized that my 30 years in the trenches of federal law weren't just about the big cases or the headlines. They were all just preparation for this one specific moment in my own backyard, where I had to prove that the law doesn't just belong to the people with the loudest voices or the fanciest clipboards. It belongs to the quiet man who knows how to read between the lines of a bank statement and isn't afraid to stand his ground when a bully tries to step on his lawn. And as I look at the brand new playground we built where Sandra's exclusive marble fountain used to stand, I see the kids playing without a single safety violation notice in sight. And I know that the battle for Oak Grove was the most important case of my life because it wasn't fought in a marble courtroom with a jury of 12. It was fought on the sidewalks and in the basements and on the front porches of people who just wanted to live their lives in peace. And the prosecutor's revenge is finally complete because the neighborhood isn't just surviving, it's thriving under a new code. A code of respect, transparency, and the fundamental understanding that you don't mess with a man who has nothing left to lose but his peace and quiet. And as the stars begin to fill the sky and the streetlights flicker on, lights that we now pay for through the city and not through a fraudulent HOA fund, I finally feel the weight of 30 years of combat and litigation fully leave my shoulders, knowing that I can finally, truly retire because there are no more monsters to hunt in Oak Grove and no more shadows left to clear. Just a quiet street, a restoration truck in the driveway, and the knowledge that justice, real grassroots suburban justice, is the sweetest thing a man can ever grow in his own front yard. And if there's one thing I want anyone listening to my story to remember, it's that your home is your castle, and no matter how many clipboards or special assessments a Karen tries to throw at you, they can never take your dignity if you're brave enough to stand up and show them exactly who you are. Because at the end of the day, a bully is just a small person with a big ego. And there is no ego on earth that can survive the cold, hard light of a federal investigation led by a man who is just looking for a quiet place to drink his coffee.